Recently, MkLeo and Maister teamed up on Luminosity Smash's show, Goat Talks, in order to make a tier list for 2024. This was exciting as it was the first time in a while that either of these players have made a recent tier list. And I mean, come on, that's the GOAT MkLeo making a tier list. Everyone wondered what his thoughts would be in regards to today's meta. Needless to say, this video generated a lot of hype. So, what were the reactions to this highly anticipated tier list? Well, I've seen people call it insane, must be satire, I've seen O2ers with better opinions, and if anyone else released this tier list, they'd be laughed off of the internet. In fact, this tier list is so outlandish that my thumbnail that you just clicked on, the names of the tiers were different, but that wasn't clickbait. Yeah, let's talk about it. Just a reminder before we begin that if you want to support me monetarily, you can do so by using links to my Patreon or channel memberships in the description below. Without further ado, let's get started. For the first time in a long time, I'm at a loss as to where I should begin. So I figured, let's just cut all of the suspense. Here's the tier list that MkLeo and Maister created. That's a little inconvenient. Let's zoom in a bit for you. Better? Alright, so where to begin? Well, as you may have already figured out, the main points of contention here are actually within the middle of this tier list. The high tier and mid tier segments. So we're actually going to go over the low tiers first, then the top tiers, and then sort of work our way into the center. That's incredibly odd, I know, but we're going to go over the easy ones first. So let's get things started. The lowest tier, called Don't Bother, is mostly controversy-free. The usual suspects, if you will, save for one, Villager. Now, I can actually understand putting Villager low, but this low and below Isabel at that is extremely interesting. But that's probably not what you were looking at. You saw the last three on this list. First of all, don't worry, that's not actually where Olimar is. The Alf here is a joke placement. But the Mies? Is that a serious placement? Well, yes and no. You see, the only Mii fighter that MkLeo and Maister actually ranked was Mii Brawler. Mii Gunner and Mii Sword Fighter were considered either so irrelevant or so terrible that they didn't even bother to actually rank them on their tier list and just stuck them at the bottom. Now, Mii Sword Fighter? Sure, fine, whatever, he'd probably be low tier anyways, but Mii Gunner? I'm shocked that Maister was okay just not ranking Mii Gunner as someone who has lost to Capitancito before. I watched all 15 games of Sonics vs Capitancito at Claro Gaming 2023, and me personally, I vehemently disagree with the notion that Mii Gunner didn't deserve to be ranked. And part of their reasoning is that they can change their moves, so it's hard to say how good they really are, but at the same time, MkLeo said, quote, "We low-key do not care," end quote. So, you know, way to set the tone for the entire tier list here, guys. Moving on to the next lowest tier, we have low tier, aptly named. This tier is mostly fine. Even though I personally think Banjo and Dr. Mario can be higher, I don't think you'll be shocking anybody by putting them down here. The most controversial pick is actually Pichu, especially coming from MkLeo, who just lost to Natoru at UFA 2023. I actually think Pichu could probably be low-high tier personally, so this pick is definitely a sore thumb in an otherwise fine list of low tiers. So now that we've gotten through the bottom two tiers, we're actually going to head up and talk about the top two tiers. I know, it's weird, but this just makes the most sense. The highest tier is the top 10 characters. Apologies if you can't see it very well. Now, who you think is top 10 in Ultimate is a fairly controversial topic, but as far as contenders go, these picks are pretty safe. Steve, Sonic, Game & Watch, all top 5. Kazuya is ranked as number 3, and Snake is ranked as number 5, which is certainly unique, but not earth-shattering by any means. You may disagree with this top 5, but remember, we're looking for stuff that will shatter the fabric of our universe on this tier list. By contrast, whether or not Kazuya is top 5 or top 10 doesn't really matter. It's a debate for another day. But while I think the top 5 is fairly standard, or at the very least conceivable, the rest of the top 10 has me a little bit conflicted. Fox and Wario? Sure, I can actually see them being up here. Fox absolutely could be top 10, and while some people think Wario is a lot worse than this, I have a higher opinion of Wario. You gotta remember, this tier list is coming from MkLeo, who fought Gluttony a ton in 2023. That's his frame of reference for Wario. so I find it natural that his opinion of the character is fairly high. And me personally, I would agree. I mean, maybe not on being number 6, but definitely within the top 10 or maybe just outside of it. But then we get to these last 3 characters, Min Min, Peach, and Aegis. Seems fine, right? Until you realize that Pikachu, Rob, and Joker are ranked below these characters. And you see, I just don't know if I buy that. This is getting a little bit messy since we're starting to talk about the next tier, but my problems with these last 3 is specifically in regard to who they're ranked above. I think Min Min, Peach, and Aegis are all extremely good characters, and all of them could absolutely be top 10. But all 3 of them ranked above Pika, Rob, and Joker? I don't think I'm the only one who would disagree with that notion. So we've gone over the top 10 as much as we can without going into the next tier. Long story short, it's a solid enough top 5, but the rest of the top 10 is a bit more iffy when looking at the next highest tier, which we'll do right now. So this is the top tier. As you can see, Pikachu, Rob, and Joker are all ranked just outside the top 10. Personally, if I had to edit this tier list, I'd probably just swap around Min Min, Peach, and Aegis with Pikachu, Rob, and Joker. You can even keep the order of them if you'd like. But I think swapping out those groups of 3 for one another just makes sense. That being said, the rest of this tier is fairly standard. ZSS is probably really high for a lot of people, but I think she definitely belongs at least in this tier. The other 2 characters of concern are Wolf and Lucina, who a lot of people would probably put lower than this. Me personally, I'm a believer in both of these characters, so I think they're fine just where they are. I actually think that this tier might be the most solid out of this entire list. There's no one here that I think doesn't belong, despite my misgivings about who's top 10 and who's not. It's mostly a matter of semantics. And that wraps up our top 10 and our top tier segment. Now it's time for us to get into the meat and potatoes of this tier list, the middle. And yes, everything we've gone over so far has just been the preamble towards the main event. These last 2 tiers are the high tier and the mid tier respectively. We're going to be going over the high tier first, as even though it has more characters, it has less problems. So here we are, high tier. Let's make things a little bit simpler and get a big chunk of this list out of the way first. I know your eyes all immediately went to the bottom row of this tier, but just ignore it for now. The first row of high tier is mostly fine. I think the main 2 characters here likely to cause controversy is Incineroar and Chrom, who are both listed here, even though many would place them in mid tier or even below that. Even though SkyJ has been making impressive moves with Incineroar, I think even some of the Incin believers don't think that he should be almost top tier, above characters like Yoshi, Bayonetta, or Mii Brawler. Chrom, on the other hand, is a lot less contentious. After all, unlike Incineroar, there are no Chrom believers, so I think it's safe to say that Chrom is pretty dang high. Now, as far as this top row goes, I actually think the rest of it is pretty solid. Even some of the most contentious characters here, which I would consider to be Wii Fit Trainer, Pit, Hero, and Jigglypuff, I think could all solidly be high tier, though I agree that they're pretty high when you consider some of the characters that got put in mid tier, but we'll get to that. That's kind of a repeating pattern throughout all of this tier list. The placements themselves are not terrible, but in relation to everything around it, none of it makes sense. If it were my tier list, all of these characters would probably be near the bottom of high tier, but I think the placement in general is fine. And that brings us to the lower half of this tier. So most of the problems of this section are tied to who got placed below them, much like we talked about with the top 10. But even then, I think a lot of people are going to look at this section and raise an eyebrow, even without the context. I think the only characters who belong in this spot are Inkling and Sephiroth, and even then, people would consider that contentious. Mewtwo and Lucario are both considered far from high tier by the majority of the community, with some people even putting both of these characters within the bottom 10. These 2 picks are some of the craziest of the entire list. Kirby and Bowser Jr., while better than Mewtwo and Lucario for sure, still aren't considered high tier by the majority of the community, mostly just being championed by their mains. Still, most would put them at the top of mid tier at best, and although this is the very bottom of high tier, it's still incredible when we take a look at who got ranked below them. And lastly is Marth. For a character that isn't even programmed correctly, Marth was put very high, but I can at least understand this one, since MkLeo probably thinks pretty highly of Marth. But that marks the end of high tier. Now we're on to the final tier for today's video, mid tier, the tier with the most problems out of this entire list. Let's not waste any time and just jump into it. So here it is. Now you probably noticed a few things right off the bat. But actually, there are some characters here that are good fits. Duck Hunt, Lucas, Ridley, Donkey Kong, King K. Rool, Ike, Robin, and with some debate, Meta Knight and Link are standard picks for mid-tier. I think most people would agree that these characters are fine. But then we have Sheik, Captain Falcon, Falco, Byleth, Ness, the Shotos, and Ice Climbers, and our brain just explodes. How are some of these characters next to the others without there being any issue? Well, in that list I just gave you, there's one example that likely stuck out to you for the same reason it stuck out to me, Byleth. Now, these days, you could actually put Byleth in mid-tier and you'd have a good chunk of people agreeing with you. But this is MkLeo, the person who piloted Byleth out of obscurity into a major winning character multiple times over. Not including the unranked characters, Byleth is listed as number 21 on this tier list, barely outside of bottom 20 in the entire game. While this placement may not be the worst thing about this list, this is the one that got people talking. Byleth mains everywhere all learned that their hero, and who many would consider Byleth's only rep at the top level, thinks so low of their character, and even after everything he did with him. This was heartbreaking to say the least. Many Byleth mains claim that they fell to their knees as soon as they saw Byleth's placement and upon hearing their hero's true feelings about the character. And while I do feel bad for them, that's not the worst thing about this tier. Not by far. So tell me, why are the Shotos below King K. Rool? Think about everything that the Shotos have accomplished in this game, especially in 2023 with players like Ashimo. And tell me, with a straight face, that they're not only mid-tier, but worse than K. Rool and Donkey Kong. I'm sorry, but this is just cap. You know who else was listed as worse than K. Rool? Ness! And even worse than that, Ice Climbers was listed as worse than Meta Knight and Ike. Only barely better than Robin. Are you serious with me right now? I'm kind of at a loss, to be perfectly honest with you. Let's not forget, Falco and Falcon are both listed below Lucas as mid-tiers. I just released a video about Kurage at Sumobato SP44, and Falco was literally the most played character in top 96 of that very tournament. You can't make this up. And then we have Sheik. For the record, I actually think Duck Hunt is too low as well, but I think the majority would disagree with me on that. After everything that WebJP has done in 2023, Sheik in mid-tier just feels sad. Just sad. And that's basically it. I really don't have much else to say. We've now gone over every single problem with this tier list, but if I've forgotten to go over something, just let me know in the comments down below. Surely we can all have a calm and peaceful discussion about this, right? Anyways, I think I'll leave you with this. Practitioners and teachers are very different. As one of my favorite YouTubers, Adam Ragusia, once put it, practitioners tend to know really well what works. They tend to not have as good of an idea on why it works. After all, this is why top players have coaches, right? And sometimes when practitioners are called upon to suddenly be teachers, we get lists like this. Oh, and there's also the possibility that this entire list was actually just an elaborate ploy in order to farm interactions on Luminosity's YouTube account and Twitter page that MkLeo and Maister intentionally put together to farm us all for interactions. In which case, good job, guys. You got us. That's going to be it for today's video. Before I go, shout out to my patrons at Laster, Frosco333, Logan S, Persipom, Wawa, Mr. Sinister, Happy Feet, and my Twitter patrons Iltis and Diamond Blaze. Additionally, shout out my YouTube members Loco Soko, Dicho Jr., Defective, Diarrhea, Fena, Boston R, Iltis, Gone SSBU, Kirby Fan, Nexus, and my Twitter members Mike G, Wu-Tang Forever, and Stormtrooper. Lastly, extra special thanks to my tier 3 patrons Ocean Man, who says, Mr. Meister sorry for playing Min Min, Mistybot, who says, in my opinion, Me Gunner is high tier, and Fat Blizzard, who says, Zamba is top 10. If you want to support me using any of these methods, links are in the description below. Also, I want to give one last sincere thanks to Let Me Fly for their continued support of my channel. Link to their Twitter page is in the description below. Don't miss tomorrow's upload, but until then, I've been Mr. Mice, and thank you all so very much for watching.